Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session, which is all about standards and certification. And of course, this session, like all the others that we're covering at the moment, is part of the Export Skills Program for Global Victoria. I'm Collins Rex. I'm a director with the Global Trade Professionals Alliance, and the GTPA is an organisation that cultivates international standards within the industry. Our aim is to create a trade environment that is both inclusive and trusted by all. And the GTPA has partnered with Global Victoria to deliver this comprehensive export skills program. For details of the full program and to register for other workshops, visit the address that you can see on your screen, and I will be sharing that one with you again at the end of today's session. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, which for me today is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I extend that respect as well to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us online today. I just draw your attention to the disclaimer on the screen. Any information that you receive in today's session is, of course, of a general nature. And if you are going to be using it for your business purposes, make sure that it is relevant to you. And in case you haven't already noticed, this webinar is being recorded. As I mentioned, I'm Collins Rex, and I'll be your presenter for today's session. So let's think for a moment about international standards and certification. Today, we're going to be talking about standards. What are they? How do they work? Why do you need them? We're going to be looking at some of the key standards bodies internationally and nationally, the role of industry-led standards, and also touching on some key standards per industry sector. Now, as I mentioned, today's session is the first in a series of sessions on standards and certification. And as we move through this series, we'll be drilling down into specific standards and certification, what they are, how you go about it, and we'll be doing all of that in a lot more detail. So today, very much an overview and a primer for you on the sessions. So let's have a look at exactly what it is we're talking about when we talk about standards. So what is a standard? Well, the standards are voluntary documents that set out specifications, procedures, guidelines that aim to ensure products, services, and systems are safe, consistent, and reliable. Standards cover a variety of subjects, and this is just a selection of those subjects: consumer products and services, the environment, construction, energy and water utilities, and then a host of others. On their own, standards are voluntary. There is no requirement for either the public or businesses to comply with standards. However, state and Commonwealth governments often refer to Australian standards or joint Australian and New Zealand standards in their legislation. And when this happens, these specific standards can become mandatory. So there's no need for you to apply a standard, but there certainly are many benefits to doing so. Using international standards allows Victorian businesses to meet internationally recognised benchmarks. Meeting standards, of course, makes it easier to compete and sell anywhere in the world because it does give potential customers an immediate understanding of your level of competence, the processes and procedures that you have in place, and the quality and consistency of production of your business and its products or services. Companies that meet international standards definitely have a competitive edge when they attempt to enter global supply and value chains. It simply means that you don't have to explain what you are capable of because the standard speaks on your behalf. Meeting standards also gives consumers confidence and can definitely lead to a marketing advantage for you and your business. So let's have a look at the key standards bodies and the key standards. So we're talking about standards pretty much at three levels. There are international standards, and these are standards that are developed by organizations like the ISO and the IEC, and they are developed for countries to adopt for national use. Then there are regional standards that are prepared by a specific region, such as the European Union's EN standards. And also, if you want to think about something like the European Union's data standard, the data privacy standard, the GDPR. There are also national standards, of course, and these are developed either by a national standards body, and in Australia that could be Standards Australia, or other credited bodies. These standards are developed under the Australian standard name, and they've been created in Australia or are adoptions or adaptations of international or other standards. The Australian design rules being a case in point here. So let's look at some of those key bodies, and the one that immediately springs to mind, of course, is the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO. Now, ISO is one of those universally understood concepts of what a standards body is. And it's quite interesting that ISO is derived from the Greek isos, meaning equal. So it really doesn't matter in which language one refers to this organization. And of course, it's different in French and English, but ISO is always ISO. It's an independent, non-governmental international organization with a membership of 167 national standards bodies, and that includes our own Standards Australia. Every country represented at the ISO has only one body representing that country. There cannot be multiples. Although through its members, it brings together experts to share knowledge and develop voluntary consensus-based market-relevant international standards. And these support innovation, they provide solutions to global challenges, and of course, they provide that level of security that everyone who meets the standard has achieved the same level of competency. The ISO's central secretariat is based in Geneva in Switzerland. Now, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about when we're talking about international standards under the ISO, 24,260 international standards currently, and these cover almost every aspect of technology and manufacturing. There are 804 technical committees and subcommittees, and these take care of standards development. So they develop new standards. They also ensure that existing standards are up to date, are current, and from time to time, new iterations of those standards are issued. As I mentioned before, the ISO has 167 members representing ISO in their country, and there is only one member per country. The ISO is constantly developing. It is constantly adding to its body of standards, and it is very responsive. So if you want to know what is happening at the ISO and you want to get a sense of their strategy for the future and how that might impact your business and the standards that you choose to apply, I've given you the address there to have a look at the ISO strategy for 2030, and it does make for some very interesting reading. This is probably also a really good time to point out that today's session, as I mentioned, is being recorded, and it will be made available after the fact by Global Victoria. But if you do want a copy of today's slide deck, you're more than welcome to drop me an email, and I'll give you my address at the end, and I'm happy to share that with you. So screenshot the address if you want, or ask me for the deck after the fact. The next body that I'd like to pause at is the International Electrotechnical Commission, or IEC. The IEC is a global not-for-profit membership organization that brings together around 170 countries and it coordinates the work of 20,000 exports globally. The IEC's work underpins quality infrastructure and international trade in electrical and electronic goods. Their work facilitates technical innovation, affordable infrastructure development, efficient and sustainable energy access, smart urbanization, transportation systems, climate change mitigation, for example, and it increases the safety of people in the environment. So the IEC works directly, and their work underpins the target of all 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. Various things that they do, they provide instructions, guidelines, rules, or definitions that are then used to design, manufacture, install, test, and certify, maintain and repair electrical and electronic devices and systems. The IEC international standards are essential for quality and risk management, and they help researchers to understand the value of innovation and allow manufacturers to produce products of consistent quality and performance. Their standards also form the basis of testing and certification. So the IEC in numbers, there are 110 technical committees, 102 subcommittees, 725 working group, and just like the ISO, thousands of standards. Something which is quite handy if you haven't had a look at the IEC before, if you are in any shape, size or form involved in electronics, or you need to be involved from an ancillary perspective because some of your customers might be, they publish an electropedia, which is the world's most comprehensive online technology database on electrotechnology, and it really is very comprehensive. If you can think of a term that in any shape, size or form relates to electricity or technology in some form or another, you will find it in the Electropedia, and you see the address there. Also makes for just really interesting reading if you're interested in that sort of thing. The next body, which of course is the one that is most relevant to us in Australia, is Standards Australia. So Standards Australia, this year been going for 100 years. They're Australia's leading independent, non-government, not-for-profit standards organisation. As representatives of the ISO and the IEC in Australia, they are specialists in the development and adoption of internationally aligned standards in Australia. So what does Standards Australia do? Well, they're involved in standards development. They offer stakeholders from a variety of sectors a range of pathways to develop or update new or existing standards. They also involved in international participation, participating in the development and adoption of a wide range of international standards. Australian standards, or Standards Australia rather, is represented at the ISO level on various committees. Accreditation of standards development organisations. So Standards Australia assesses and approves other organisations to develop Australian standards. Now, very importantly to note that Standards Australia is not responsible for enforcing, regulating or certifying compliance with standards. So they might be the body at which you go and get all the information about, for example, ISO 9000, but they will not certify your organization. That is done by a third-party organization that specializes in certification. Of course, in addition to the major bodies, there are also industry standards. And industry standards are documents that contain requirements that have been agreed on by groups of companies and people working in specific industries or on specific types of products. The standards address product performance, safety, reliability, methods for evaluating product performance, reliability, safety, etc. And these are often seen as codes of conduct or practice. And some examples there: the Banking Code of Practice, the Telecommunications Consumer Protections Code, the Franchising Code of Conduct, and any number of others. If you are involved in an industry, particularly if you're a member of an industry body, there's a very good chance that you will be across those industry standards that are part of your specific sector. Now, I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at HACCP. I know there are several people on today's session that are involved in the food sector. HACCP is a really important standard for you if you are involved in food in any shape, size, or form. So HACCP stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points. It's a food safety and risk assessment plan that was initially developed in the 1960s by NASA. We always wonder why we go to space and do things of that nature. Well, one of the reasons why we've done that is because we end up with a standard like HACCP. The two groups came together to solve two critical problems facing NASA's crewed space missions, which is crumbs and disease-producing microorganisms and toxins. So HACCP principles form the basis of food safety programs that are accepted worldwide and also required worldwide. HACCP principles can be applied to processes throughout every stage of the food supply chain, including production, preparation, packaging, and distribution. And HACCP is used to manage food safety across many different types of food businesses. There are 7 basic principles of HACCP. First of all, you conduct a hazard analysis, which of course is the initial process of identifying potential hazards. Then there's identifying critical control points. And a CCP is a point in the food preparation process where hazards can be reduced, eliminated, and prevented. Establishing of critical limits, and a critical limit is the maximum or minimum value to which a food safety hazard must be controlled. The next step in the chain is monitoring critical control points, and that of course is generally monitoring, which can be broken down into 4 different categories: observation, sensory, chemical, and physical. Establishing corrective actions. If a hazard exceeds its critical limit, a corrective action must be taken. And then the final 2, there's the establishment of record keeping, which is vitally important, and that is a comprehensive and up-to-date record must be kept of any hazard, along with details of any corrective actions. And finally, there's an establishment of a verification procedure within the business. These help to identify and to determine if the HACCP food safety program actually works in your business to prevent the hazards that have been identified, and you need to perform an audit on a regular basis. So important to note that HACCP is a legal requirement. So at the start of today's session, I pointed out that most standards are voluntary, and indeed they are. In the case of food safety, HACCP is a legal requirement. For most food businesses in Australia, having a food safety program based on the 7 principles is a legal requirement. Standard 3.2.1 of the Food Standards Code enables states and territories to require food businesses to implement a food safety program based upon the HACCP concepts. The food safety program is to be implemented and reviewed by the food business and is subject to periodic audit by a suitably qualified food safety auditor. I'd like as well to pause on fair trade. We've all seen the fair trade logo on a number of goods, and it might be something that you're familiar with, but if you're not, the fair trade mark is the most recognized ethical label in the world. The Fair Trade Network brings together nearly 2 million farmers and workers across the planet. And fair trade does 2 things. They set a minimum price for those in their network, and they command premium prices. So this is all about providing a safety net for small scale farmers. And it's also a way of fixing an additional amount of money that provides farmers and workers with the capacity to invest in improving the quality of their business and their communities. You don't have to have a fair trade symbol. It is just something that will add a marketing benefit if you are a producer. But if you are dealing with suppliers, that is very important. If you are purchasing products in your supply chain, particularly from smaller businesses in emerging economies, you really do need to make sure that they are part of the Fair Trade Network or that they have other protections in place, because you could be called upon to prove that later on. Similarly, modern slavery is something that no business can not be cognizant of at the moment. Modern slavery describes situations where offenders use coercion, threats, or deception to exploit victims and undermine their freedom. And this includes things like human trafficking, slavery, servitude, debt bondage, etc. Very important to note, though, that modern slavery is a term used to describe serious exploitation. It does not include practices like substandard working conditions or underpayment of workers. And this is something which is very often confusing in the market. People assume that that is covered by modern slavery. It is not. Modern slavery is for really serious transgressions. However, if you, again, have a fairly lengthy supply chain and you are buying goods in, or indeed services in, from downstream businesses, you need to be conscious of the fact that they are not practicing modern slavery. So in Australia, we have the Modern Slavery Act, which came into force in 2018. That's when it was determined. It entered into force finally on the 1st of January 2019, and it established a modern slavery reporting requirement. Now, this reporting requirement applies only to large businesses and other entities in the Australian market with an annual consolidated revenue of at least $100 million a year. Now, this might not apply to many of you in today's session, but it is nevertheless something to be aware of, because if you are downstream from a business that is in that bracket of 100 million AUD, they could look to you for reporting so that they can meet their own reporting requirements. So bear that in mind. It really doesn't matter where you sit in the supply chain. If you are in a supply chain, you might be called upon to report on modern slavery of both your suppliers and to your customers. And there are various things that have to be complied with. It's really important to be across this. Go and have a look at the Act and get a sense of the obligations under the law. So I'd like to pause now on some key standards of which everyone needs to be aware and of which many of us already are. And I'm starting off with the ISO IEC 17024 and 17065 standard for international trade. This is a standard which has been designed by the GTPA and is administered by GTPA, and indeed the certification for this standard occurs by the GTPA. And for all those of you that are attending this particular module in the Export Skills program, if you attend the entire module, by the end of it, you will qualify for free assessment under ISO IEC 17024, but a lot more about that later on in the program. So 17024 for global trade professionals is an individual standard. It's the certification of professional competence in various global trade disciplines, including trade management, trade regulation and compliance, trade finance and supply chain finance, and trade policy. And certification is at one of 3 levels: practitioner, manager, or executive, and those are the post-nominals that you will carry. Then there's ISO IEC 17065 for globally trading businesses and consultancies. And if you're wondering why ISO and IEC, it's because these are trade standards, and the IEC, even though they take care of electrotechnical fields, also take care of trade in those fields. In ISO 17065, businesses are assessed against 9 key themes and characteristics, and you can see them there. We don't have to go through them all, but it really is a way of getting a sense of what your business is capable of. We'll talk later on in this program as well about the assessment that you can undertake as part of Global Victoria through the Go Global Accelerator tool, and that covers the same areas as ISO 17065. The next family that I'd like to pause on is ISO 9000, and this is probably the most instantly recognized ISO standard in the world. Even if we don't all have a detailed knowledge of what is involved in ISO 9000 or 9001, we all quote the standard regularly because everyone knows that it exists. So the ISO 9000 family is the world's best known quality management standard, and it applies equally to organizations of any size, and it's multi-sectoral as well. ISO 9001 sets out the criteria for a quality management system, and it is the only standard in the family that can be certified to. So there are various standards in the family, but the only one that you can actually be certified towards is ISO 9001. It can be used by any organization, large or small, regardless of the field of activity, and currently over 1 million companies in over 170 countries are certified to ISO 9001. Standard is based on a number of quality management principles, including a very strong customer focus, motivation and implication of top management, process approach, and continual improvement. The next standard I'd like to touch on is ISO IEC 27001, which is for information security management. And this provides security for any kind of digital information. The ISO 2700 family of standards is designed again for any standard of organization. 27001 is widely known. It provides requirements for an information security management system, although there are more than a dozen standards in the family. Like all ISO management system standards, certification to ISO IEC 27001 is possible, but not obligatory. Some organizations choose to implement the standard in order to benefit best practice, but they don't get certified. So you can do it on a voluntary basis. If you want to claim it though, you do need certification. The ISO 45000 family is the occupational health and safety family of standards, and these reduce workplace risks. Structured in a way similar to other ISO management systems, the approach will be very familiar to you if you use standards like ISO 9001. It builds on the success of earlier international standards, and there are various ones that you can look at. Lots of international standards, including the ILO's international labor standards and conventions. Now, we've already talked about HACCP, which of course is a thing in and of itself. ISO also has a food safety management standard, ISO 22000. ISO's food safety management standards help organizations to identify and control food safety hazards. Now, if you have a certification under ISO 22000 and any one in the family, you will still need a HACCP qualification and a HACCP certification. So just bear that in mind as well. The one does not replace the other. I'd like to talk a little bit about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I think we've all heard about the SDGs. It's a body of goals that dates back to 2015, when the UN set a very ambitious 15-year plan to address some of the most pressing issues faced by the world. You can see the 17 goals there. It starts with no poverty at number 1, and it goes all the way through to number 17 in partnerships for goals. Now, why do we take cognizance of the SDGs? Well, we take cognizance of the goal because for each goal, ISO has identified the standards that make the most significant contribution to the SDGs. Now, with ISO standards covering almost every subject imaginable, from technical solutions to systems that organize processes and procedures, there are numerous standards that correspond to each of the SDGs. It is something that you want to be thinking about from a moral perspective and an ethical perspective, but it is also something you want to be thinking about from a marketing perspective. And if you comply with the ISO standard, if you are certified, you will then also be able to claim that you correspond with the SDG that standard actually applies to. Again, there's an address on the screen there. You can see the corresponding standards that relate to all of those UN SDGs. And it really is pretty comprehensive. And that gives us our snapshot of standards. As I said, today, very much a primer, an introduction to standards and certification. We will be going into this subject in a lot more detail. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box, and I'm happy to take them now. Just to give you a sense of where we're going with this particular module, the next module in the series, which is on the 4th of May, we're going to be looking at standards, certification, and value chains. So why is it that standards and certification are important concepts if you are entering global value or global supply chains? And indeed, how do you do that? Now, we've already touched today on the importance of reporting both upstream and downstream, and that is certainly one of the issues that you need to be taking into account. And then we're going to spend the rest of this module, and there are 5 webinars in total. The rest of the module is devoted to certification. So we'll be looking at a number of different standards in some detail, and then also how you go about getting certified under all of those various standards. We'll be publishing a lot more information, and you can also see more of that detail on the Global Victoria website. So have a look at that, and you'll choose the webinar that is most appropriate to your industry sector. Now, it doesn't look as if we have any questions. I think we've probably overwhelmed you a little bit with the fairly comprehensive amount of information. So all that remains then in today's session is to point you in the direction of a couple of addresses. First of all, the Export Skills program in its entirety, all 5 modules. And as I mentioned, the standards and certification module is just one of those. You can see the address on the screen there. But if you also just go to the homepage, global.vic.gov, you'll be able to follow the link to the program. Rogers, you've asked, are these standards available to the public? Yes, they are. Just a caveat there, the standards are available through Standards Australia. And if you want to get the actual standard, the document that relates to the standard, there is a charge that is levied by Standards Australia. Depending on the standard, that charge can be quite substantial. So if you want to know exactly what is in a standard and you need the entire text, you will have to purchase it. So just bear that in mind. But yes, they are publicly available. If you go to the ISO website or the IEC website, you can also see a great deal of information about the standards. So you can find a lot of publicly available information there. My contact detail is on the screen. It's collinsrex@gtpalliance.com. If you do have any questions about today's session or indeed about the program, please feel free to drop me an email. And if you would like a copy of today's deck, again, send me an email to that address and I will be more than happy to share that deck with you. So thank you very much, everyone, for your attention. I know we've covered a fair amount of ground today. Standards and certification, obviously something that is very close to my heart because it is the reason for existence of the Global Trade Professionals Alliance. So looking forward to delving into some of this in more detail as we move through this program. Thank you, everyone. Look forward to the pleasure of your company at the next one in this series, which, as I said, is a week from today. Of course, we've got all sorts of other modules as well. For those of you that have attended Marketing Market Class, we'll be doing a face-to-face series, or rather a face-to-face event in this one next week. And then, of course, we've got cyber security readiness coming up in May, and also advanced e-commerce, of which the second in the series is tomorrow, and international business rules kicking off in June. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you all online again very soon. Goodbye.